All right, so today we're going to look specifically at the role that the new learning standards, new generation learning standards are having on assessment and spend a little bit of time about, what this can teach us about the relationship between these assessments and or these standards and assessments. So we're going to review the major shifts embedded in the new generation standards. We're going to model how to unpack a testing item and then begin to consider pedagogical implications of both the standards and the assessments that come along with them. So, I know, let me begin by saying I understand that there's a lot of political conversation around the standards. There's a lot of policy that has nothing to do with student achievement and does nothing but create stress and I think impediments to that achievement. But I do want to let you know that the premise here is that the standards themselves are not the issue so much as, or the next generation tests are not really the issue so much as all the policy that's been around them. So I'm going to spend some time looking at these, but try to remove it from that political landscape, which I know is a pipe dream, and I understand that that can be frustrating for you, and I just want to acknowledge that and tell you that I get it, and I think that that's a valid concern. So if you don't already have a copy of the Ohio New Learning Standards or the Common Core State Standards, please have those ready and available. And if you need help reading the standards, I will include a link for you to look at if you haven't ever read the standards, although I can't imagine that's too many of us. So what I wanted to begin looking at really is, I just want to talk about these questions here of how we got to where we're at. So the Common Core State Standards, and I'm not sure how many of you know the history of the Common Core State Standards, but the Common Core State Standards come out of the National Governors Association, and they have their roots in discussions about No Child Left Behind. Really what was happening was, there was some concern that in 2008 that perhaps the No Child Left Behind was not meeting, getting us where we wanted to get in terms of marginalized students, students of color, perhaps meeting the needs of students with disabilities. And so the National Governors Association started an initiative that was really designed to look at improving math and science education for the purposes of workforce development. From this task force, what emerged was was a focus on the Common Core State Standards that really were rooted in the ideas of No Child Left Behind. Under President George W. Bush, this education law required states to test, disaggregate, and report data on student performance, but it allowed states to continue to decide what their standards might be and what tests to report on. So what became problematic was that that the standards became problematic is that we weren't really comparing states apples to apples. In some states the standards were much more rigorous and the testing was much more rigorous than other states, and some states were manipulating it because they wanted to look better in the reporting. So there was a desire to create this mistake, to correct this mistake, and the Common Core State Standards developed. And they began by looking at what the college and career readiness anchor standards were the starting point. So they spent a lot of time, they spent about the first 2 years looking at that, releasing those in 2010, and then moving on to the Common Core Standards. Well, as you can imagine, there's a lot of pushback. We're not used to having any kind of nationalized approach to education. Education has largely been a state function, and so and under local control. So there was, especially when we moved into the testing, and originally there was two different national. There was the PARC tests, and then there was the I can't remember that, but there were two testing companies that were doing the state that Common Core State Standards, and those two testing companies, when Ohio's kids took them for the first time, we found a third of our students didn't meet the standards on the PARC exam. So that just kind of exacerbated the resistance to the standards. So what happened was in 2017, Ohio revised we technically are not a Common Core state standard, but we essentially are because our ELA, our math and science or language arts standards are essentially the Common Core state standards, but we made some minor changes. We didn't really make any major revisions. For instance, the reading standards included a verbiage about activating prior knowledge and allowed teachers to blend new criticism approach, which was what had been in the Common Core standards, with reader response. So new criticism is the text only, but we started to develop, okay, reader response, let's work on getting the students to be able to transact with the text a little bit more personally. But substantially the standards remain grounded in the work of the Common Core state standards. So what were the shifts? I'm sorry, my family's going crazy with a text message. So what were the key shifts that we were looking at? So what changed as a result of the new Ohio learning standards compared to what we had been traditionally doing? Well, Ohio identified key shifts. Rather than focusing solely on the skills of reading and writing, the ELA and literacy standards highlight the growing complexity that of the text that students have to be ready for and the demands. So one of the first things that they did was they required regular practice with complex texts in their academic language. So the standards call for a staircase of increasing complexity so that all students are ready for the demands of college and career level reading, no matter when they, by the time they end their high school, no matter where they go to school. So that was the first shift. So then the standards also call for students to grow their vocabulary, okay, with words that appear in a variety of content areas such as ignite or commit. The standards call for students to grow their vocabulary through a mix of conversation, direct instruction, and reading. They ask that students determine word meanings, appreciate the nuances of words, and steadily expand their range of words. Vocabulary conventions are treated in their own strand, but not because skills in that area have been handed in isolation, because they extend to reading, writing, and listening. So the shifts that we identified in Ohio are regular practice with complex texts, reading, writing, and speaking grounded in evidence from the text, both literary and informational, and building knowledge through content-rich nonfiction. So what do these shifts look like? In terms of, what it looks like for the students. So let's look at these. Students read a true balance of informational literary texts. Students build knowledge about the world and domains, content areas through text rather than teacher activities. Students read central, grade-appropriate texts around instruction that is centered around this. Teachers are patient, create more space and support for the curriculum for close reading. Students engage in rich and rigorous evidence-based conversations about the text. Writing emphasizes the use of evidence, and students constantly build the transferable vocabulary they need to access grade-level complex texts. So these really have some important implications for us as far as how we teach, and even from first grade on. So it's important for us to recognize that this is something that is important from first grade on, that these shifts are not something just for the older student. So let's delve deeper into the assessments and consider how they reflect the shifts and maybe how they drive classroom change. So first thing I'm going to do is show you a little video about new generation tests, which is certainly what Ohio's tests are.
The tests will be more challenging. They'll reflect the Common Core. So the passages that students will be asked to read will be more challenging than the kinds of things they've been asked to read in the past. They will be required to use evidence to support their arguments. They will be required to do multiple-step math problems that will really test their conceptual understanding in mathematics. So it is true that the tests will be more challenging because the Common Core standards are more challenging than our existing state standards. But again, we've been moving our curriculum since 2010 towards the Common Core. It wouldn't have made any sense to have our assessments not reflect the curriculum that we're teaching. And so we've got to have alignment between the assessments and the instruction. And as students are now engaged in Common Core instruction, we need to assess their performance against the Common Core, and it will inform educators and parents about where we are with respect to the Common Core and really with respect to college and career readiness. But lower proficiency scores, a lower percentage of 3s and 4s, does not mean that schools are doing worse or that students have learned less. What it tells us is where we are against the bar of college and career readiness.
Okay, so we entered into this knowing that we were going to definitely be looking at more students that would be identified as not proficient because we had upped the bar. And that's something that we definitely have seen in Ohio. But we've also seen steady progress in as students are spending more time, more of their, more years under these new learning standards. We're seeing us shift, which is what we would hope that we were seeing a shift. So in Ohio, the Ohio English Language Arts test is what we would call a next generation test. And I wanted to point out to you that there is actually, there's a portal here where you can get test blueprints, so you can get their test specifications, and you're going to get some samples of the test. So I'm going to send you this information on Leo, more information, because you're going to want to be able to look at these. Because what you're going to do is you're going to unpack a testing item. So let's look at this video that talks about how to unpack a sample assessment item.
Step 5 takes us into what do students need to know, what do they need to be able to do to demonstrate that they're meeting or approaching mastery of the standard. If you look at that very first item, it's a vocabulary item. What's the meaning of the word adversariate as it's used in paragraph 21 of the passage from Byron's Winter? In step 5, we'll really look at what are the standards and evidences that are being measured. There are actually 2 standards being measured, RL4 and L4. Now ask yourself, what do the students need to know to be able to answer the item?
They would have to know how to use context and how to go back to the text.
With step 5, we're really looking at the task and asking what students need to really know and understand, and then how would they apply and synthesize that knowledge and understanding.
We actually got to align the questions that were asked for the text to the standards. So what I learned from that process, I'm able to figure out how to create my own questions back in the classroom so that I can align the standards to the questions that I'm asking of my students as well.
An exciting moment happened in working with the middle school team and looking at an item around summary. The item itself asks for students to take a series of statements and to choose 4 of those statements to drag and drop into a box in sequence to create an objective summary.
The first thing they have to learn is, what do you actually see from these choices that actually is in the text?
We talked about what would be involved in such an activity, and we agreed that part of what students need to know and be able to do is to understand what's the difference between an objective summary and a non-objective summary. What does that mean to be objective? Not an I believe this is what's important about the text, but this is what the text says, and here's the order that it says it, and these are the most important ideas, the most salient points. And that ability to abstract from a text is such a critical college and career ready skill.
It's multidisciplinary.
Yes.
Your science teacher has to, your social studies
Everybody
teacher has
has to be on board
that's going to reinforce a skill that they can take to any test.
In order for students to be able to be successful, they really had to have that understanding of the story structure, the text structure, and also character development, and how characters have struggles and conflicts with themselves and those around them, and how those struggles cause them to grow and change and evolve over time.
So, as far as what I learned from that process, I'm able to figure out how to create my own questions back in the classroom so that I can align the standards to the questions that I'm asking of my students as well.
All right. So what we have here then is, I'm going to ask you to do the same thing. I'm going to ask you to unpack a test item. And as you're unpacking the test item, and I'll send you the link to this video so that you can watch it again if you want, but I want you to think about what can we learn from examining sample assessment items. Can help us both with our with aligning our instruction, with giving us models for our own assessment, but think about what we can learn from examining sample assessment items. How can sample assessment items help you create your own questions? And how can you imagine using sample assessment items in your own teaching? Okay, so those are questions that you're going to have as you think about how to explore and consider the Common Core State Standards Next Generation Assessments and your own sort of work in your classroom. Okay, thank you, and see you.